Hello everyone, I am Manu Chaubey from ixchel.life and this is the Hopeful Rant where we discuss workplace and well-being. Today I am in this beautiful co-working space called Huddle and I have the founding team with me, Sanil and Ishan. Thank you for joining us on our very first video podcast on the Hopeful Rant. And you guys are not afraid of doing new things, right?
I hope not.
Yeah, so this is a really amazing co-working space and beautifully designed and very well lit, I must say. So it's amazing how recently co-working trend has caught up in India, especially, right? So when did Huddle step into the co-working space, and how do you guys see the trend coming up?
I think when the co-working trend came up, that was the first sign that India is a startup nation.
Yeah,
Huddle came about when we realized that startups are there, but there's a sense of dropout in
yeah,
startups. A lot of space is there, but how do you provide efficiency to the space?
yeah,
So the concept of Huddle, when Ishan and I really sat down, we realized as entrepreneurs in our own fields
yeah,
that you provide a space, but that's not what a startup wants.
yeah,
So the aspect of Huddle really came about from the need of providing 360-degree support,
yeah.
which is there, but how do you get it in one place?
Yeah. So that's amazing, Ishan. As we were discussing before the start of the podcast about the whole co-working trend catching up in India, and I was going through a report from JLL, and they mentioned that there are 300 co-working spaces in India, both branded and unbranded. What's fascinating is 90% of those workspaces started after 2016. So that is really amazing, right? So we are really seeing a new trend in terms of workplaces.
Right. So, all the new trends in India work similarly. A big player comes in,
Yeah,
they see some success, and then you see 100 other players follow
yeah,
suit.
yeah,
But what's interesting about this space is that the demand is sort of followed through very, very quickly. So, given that, as Anand mentioned, the startup ecosystem in India is really, really fueled very, very recently. And that is fueled up very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So, the scalability aspect has provided these workspaces a lot of room to target different audiences.
yeah.
So that has really given a complex dimensioning to the whole space.
Yes, and there's so co-working space is not really about only startups, right? So there are big firms who are also coming, who are also utilizing the benefits of co-working spaces. Like there is Facebook is also right now into currently one of the co-working space outside India, of course. I was talking to Ishan. I told him that I visited Alstom in a co-working space.
Yeah.
Interestingly, so even big players are big companies, big corporations are also recognizing the benefits of co-working space.
Uh, you know, the analogy that, to your point of having several players in different fields, different
Yeah.
starters and sectors, it's a bit like a gym.
Yeah.
In a gym, you've got people who've reached your goal,
Yeah.
and you're also then in that stage where someone has seen you, because everyone's trying to reach that other person's goal. So you've got different players.
Yeah.
So it's a sense of aspirational and inspiration that comes in together, which is where you've got, whether you want to call them large corporate houses or to be
Yeah.
large corporate houses working in the same environment.
Yeah.
Because collaboration can come in sometimes when you're sitting next to your competitor as well.
Exactly. And this is what co-working space offers. Spontaneous collaboration and spontaneous networking, spontaneous business opportunities.
Right.
And for us, collaboration, we have been building ourselves on collaboration in terms of this content creation. Everything else is based on collaboration. So co-working space is a really interesting addition when it comes to being people who are hungry for collaboration, hungry for networking. But there is a what do you think is a difference between you're working remotely versus when you're working in a co-working space, especially for freelancers, who often do not have their offices. They work from their home or from a coffee shop, and how co-working spaces can offer value and benefits for them.
So, one of the largest elements that come to play when you're doing a venture on your own. So essentially, a freelancer is essentially an entrepreneur at the end of the day. because he is doing his own venture.
Yeah, of course.
The only limitation is that he doesn't pride himself as a company who's looking to do this with full-fledged clients, but it's also sort of floating clients.
Yeah.
But the way we like to sort of think about it is that, each entrepreneur has this sense of loneliness through the journey.
Yeah.
So
it's a lonely journey.
Yeah, it's very, very important. I think all of us have sort of realized it as entrepreneurs that at times you just want to sort of be around people that are feeling the same pain.
Yeah.
So that is one of the biggest aspects that co-working really sort of adds value in terms of the entire process of an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
That, you have someone who's going through the whole journey alongside you, but he might be from different realms, which is absolutely fine.
Yeah, of course.
But the inherent value that you're sort of getting out of those interactions is very similar. Because you're sort of reaching a point where you're saying that, am I in this alone? But when you're in the company of others, you sort of get that sense that no.
Yeah.
And that is very, very important through the journey of an entrepreneur. So that is one of the biggest, I feel is one of the biggest advantages of being in a space where other people are working alongside you.
And also, Sanil, I think, co-working spaces also offer networking in a way which no other workplace can offer. So, networking, especially for freelancers also, is quite important. For everybody, networking is the key in this age and time.
I think, to your point of spontaneous collaboration, I think that's what it's co-working essentially is being in the pond where, everyone is, to Ishan's point, swimming alone. But you're swimming towards a certain direction, which is the same direction. Now, how a freelancer can obviously, make advantage of it is they don't have to viciously look out. They have to just look around.
Yeah.
At the same time, and this is something that we've personally seen as well. During essentially a huddle up session when we have people coming in together and meeting, people have walked in individually, walked out in collaboration. And that's only because co-working stimulates, a sense of, where you are meeting someone who's got a similar wavelength as you.
Yeah.
And you're bound to collaborate. It is a bit like two opposing magnets, but over here you've got, people who understand each other and more importantly, cater to the other person's weakness.
Yeah.
And that's where, to your point, collaboration spurs.
Is important.
Yes.
And collaboration, networking, and other thing is mentorship. So, if you're working from a traditional office, the access to the mentors which you can have is only limited to people in your company. But when you're working from a co-working space, mentorship, it opens gates to, a lot of people who can be your mentor and, who can guide you, who have been through the same journey as you are going through. Co-working space are especially, especially about benefits which traditional office space cannot offer. So mentorship is one, and I think Huddle is really pitching in that particular sector, right?
Right. So, I mean, we really wanted to sort of come in from that aspect where we realized that there's a missing gap in terms of the intellectual capital that is available to the startup ecosystem and also sort of ventures that have made it to a certain level, but also, of course, hit some roadblocks along the way. So it's that whole aspect to find that perfect marriage where someone's been through the journey, experienced a lot of things, maybe in different business functions, and now can add value to a new corporation or an existing corporation in different ways. It's not necessarily from the aspect that, that it is the end all be all, that whatever the mentor says that is the end goal. It's really about being there through the journey to be able to say that, maybe this is the right way. Maybe this is the right direction for the company. Maybe this is something that would open up new avenues that you might not have thought of. Or even if you've thought of that, maybe a certain tweak would help the company move along in a separate way. So it's that whole aspect that we sort of realized, that whole aspect really adds a lot of value to an end company. It's not really about just working out of space, it's sort of making sense of why you're here.
Yeah. So that's why I said, it's also about benefits, not just about amenities.
Yeah.
So amenities is like, having a good meeting hall, good VC room. But benefits is essentially about, it's about networking, mentorship, and collaboration.
I think, to add to Ishan's point, and as you mentioned, corporations have the access to board of directors, they've got the access to getting, past data of their company, to understand where the hiccup and the roadblock comes. And of course, now going back to the first point of how co-working, why is co-working so important? It has to be an area where you sort of incubate yourself at any level, or you propel yourself at any level. Take incubation and especially co-working as a trampoline. You have to bounce up.
Yeah.
So when we created a sense of, the network of mentors, be it from the likes of Microsoft or SoftBank or Tata, it was not the names of the operations that were coming on board or the mentors, but to understand why can't an entrepreneur or a new venture also have essentially an advisor, or look at them as your board of director, while you are one as well. Getting people who are today's industry leaders with tomorrow's is essentially why Huddle really created a model of mentorship that we pride ourselves on.
Yeah, so basically providing access to those people who are otherwise, difficult to get through.
The thing is, they're not actually difficult to get through.
Yeah.
It's just being in the same room to be able to brainstorm with someone rather than just have access to them.
Yeah.
To be able to sit with them on a weekly basis and then realize that it's going to be a bond.
Yeah.
That where they come on board with your company, that's where we really come in as Huddle. And that's the essential point and the terminology of huddling together.
So huddling together, basically with people who can add a lot of value in terms of, not in terms of finance, but in terms of intellectual capability to your idea and your venture. One more thing which is very essential for a co-working space is its community. So a co-working space is as good as its community. And I was reading somewhere that communities are like organisms. You cannot build a community. You have to grow it. And so what is, I'm really curious to know what Huddle is about, thinking about communities, what your vision is about creating a community around Huddle.
So whole aspect, I guess, about community, about Huddle is essentially bringing the right people together. So when we talk about, what we envision to do with Huddle is not really about just the people working out of the space. It's about connecting them to people who are the relevant stakeholders. If a startup requires, access to an investor, to someone who's an influencer for their business, it's really about establishing a community, not just about the people that are housed within Huddle, who are physically present here, but also with the relevant stakeholders, a part of the ecosystem, who would then add value to the entire engagement.
Yeah. So community is like, so it's a very diverse community. If I'm imagining this, that, a bunch of entrepreneurs sitting together, none of them from a same sector, and with bunch of mentors, none of them from a same sector. So the kind of brainstorming and the value addition you get from that kind of setup, is unmatched and unprecedented also. I think, a lot of co-working space offer benefits in terms of networking, but, a large part of networking should be with mentors. Because for an entrepreneur at any stage, learning is always it's one thing which always remains, and you learn with people who are better.
I think to a word that I actually learned from you, and I started to imbibe from you, is the term unlearn. I think what we need to do at times is unlearn and learn, and this is coming from our conversation before this, and I've heard you say it as well. So that's exactly what happens when we, reaching out to these mentors, these business partners is important, but that takes away also the efficiency for the company working. It becomes essentially what can be an operational hazard because they're spending their time into a secondary strength. So we didn't want efficiency to go down. The companies we like to associate ourselves with and want to be associated with are those who know that, although they can think in a broad perspective, we want them to concentrate on their strength. And let us handle the 360 element of essentially being the trampoline. The idea is not to be housed in a co-working space. The idea is to grow.
Exactly.
And essentially, go to wherever that growth takes you.
So that's a really interesting way to put it. It's not about being housed in a co-working space, but it's about growing in a co-working space. And that brings me to some of the challenges that co-working space might be facing today. One such challenge, which I think personally can be distraction. Like, if I'm working with bunch of energetic dudes who are really passionate, and the place is buzzing all around, so I might lose on distraction. So how does a co-working space actually takes care of these things, like putting a focus in what you're doing when you're sitting with 50 people who are as energetic, as passionate as you are?
So a lot of times, it's got two sides of the coin. A lot of times you might feel that it's very distracting, where it's being counterproductive, and at that time is when you need to look at the other spaces that a co-working space offers. So essentially, at Huddle we have like a brainstorming room, for instance.
Yeah.
So and we have a common area seating. So
Yeah.
it's really about thinking about okay, fine, your workstation is limiting you at certain times, but you're more than flexible to be able to get up and use another area.
Yeah.
To be able to say that, okay, fine, maybe I need a break. Maybe this is being counterproductive for myself.
Yeah.
So it's all about that flexibility. It's about how you end up using that flexibility to your benefit.
Yeah.
And how you can sort of accommodate the advantages of that.
Yeah.
And take it in your stride.
And I think also the sense of distraction only comes in when there's a lack of focus.
Yeah.
And that happens. In fact, a lack of focus is needed again, because you have to look at things in a new perspective.
Yeah.
So distraction isn't always a negative. However, when distraction does take place, you are around people that, again, to the word stimulating, the reason I repeat that is because that does tend to happen when you're sitting next to someone who's dedicated towards their cause.
Yeah.
It's like looking at someone doing that extra push-up in a gym.
Yeah.
That's essentially what happens.
Yes.
Plus, if you keep seeing industry leaders that you want to access walking in, your sense of focus does increase on its own.
Yeah. So, that's always there. And that's just a question which I had in my mind, because this is relatively new to people, to working millennials in India. Like, people who have, they are habitual to go into an office space which has, people from their company and working in similar kind of way, versus, a co-working space like Huddle. So it's a quite different environment, so to say. One more challenge which I think is it's a long-term challenge which I think is cost effectiveness. Like, of course, in that same JLL report, I was reading that in comparison to a traditional office, a co-working space can reduce your cost to around 20 to 25%. But still, how to make it more accessible to entrepreneurs, freelancers, people who really need it, and people who will really add value to it, to the community. So what do you think, how to, because a co-working space has to be very well designed for, to keep people motivated and energetic. So how do you think we can cut down on the cost part of that?
So I think cutting down the costs, this is sort of, how people think about real estate.
Yeah.
It's all about location, accessibility, and infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it all depends. It's all a factor of how those three things play.
Yeah.
You might find a co-working space that might offer amenities but is not located in an accessible location, or it might not have access to a lot of the different opportunities that we've just discussed in terms of networking, in terms of other things. So it's all sort of mix of three different factors, and how that is attributed. It all depends, whether it's right for a person or not.
Yeah.
I think when you think about costs, it's all a matter of finding the right fit.
Yeah.
It's not. It might be expensive. It might not fit into the budget. But it's all a matter of finding the right fit for you. What are the sort of value that is being generated apart from the space?
Yeah.
It's not just a factor of the space, about to look beyond that.
Yeah. So I think, one has to really look at this whole idea of co-working in a broader picture than just looking at it as a real estate thing.
Most definitely. To Ishan's point, certain companies might not need mentorship.
Yeah.
So, and if you look at a price that a space is offering and they provide mentorship, that might be a cost to you, because you're not looking at mentorships. But if you're looking at, let's say, a relevant partner in the hospitality sector, you're looking at a relevant partner because that particular space attracts your clientele, then what you're essentially doing is cutting down on your marketing costs.
Yeah.
So, to Ishan's point, sometimes location is very important, because let's say you walk out and you're you're in, a sea filled with your potential clientele, that essentially cuts down marketing costs, that cuts down your communication towards these people. How do you reach out to them? It cuts down a lot of leads.
Yeah.
Or it creates leads at the same time. So it all depends on not catering to only the short-term goals.
And to add you to your point, there is something. There's one cost which you also incur when you're finding the right partner. But when you collaborate, that cost is taken care of. So because in today's world, collaboration is grossly underpriced. And once you collaborate with like-minded people, you might save on monetary benefits and create something which is very, very valuable, which might have not been possible if you are working remotely or from a traditional office space.
And you should always it's when we've worked in co-working spaces, to check how it is to get also encouraged to the aspect of distraction. It was encouraging to work in those areas, but when someone chooses a co-working space, or it's as simple as someone chooses a place to live for their home, you have to see the community around. You have to see what the values are there. So if that co-working space, the value that they're adding, if it is a sense of growth, if it is a sense of expansion tomorrow for you, you have to resonate with them. It's and I'm talking about the space, the owners of the space, the founders, more than just the community.
Yeah.
What is their vision? If it can match yours, then you're talking about a very seamless fit.
Yeah. I was also reading that, co-working spaces globally will take over the traditional offices by 2020.
I hope so.
And and that's not very far. Like just 2 years from now, co-working spaces will be taking over the traditional office spaces. Right. In India, I think by 2025, 42% of the Indians will be living in and working in urban centers. So, what trends do you see for next year in terms of co-working spaces? What do you think will be changing? What will be happening in terms of when you're looking at a co-working space?
So one of the factors that we've been seeing is the advent of corporates really looking to open format or co-working spaces for their sort of requirements. Either it's for their remote teams in different locations, whether they don't have a head office here or headquarters here. They're looking at just a small team. They would rather have them housed in a co-working space to sort of increase that element of collaboration and networking that we've been discussing. To that point also, a lot of new teams have been looking at, just sitting here in terms of sales opportunities.
Yeah.
That is one big play in terms of where companies are looking at spaces where they're sort of looking to divide their workforce in different locations to be able to generate more leads for the company.
That's very interesting. Like you will get very, very localized leads in that terms. Once your sales team is exactly present where your customer is, like for 24 hours a day, there's no reason why you won't be selling more than somebody, your competitor, whose sales team is not exactly there where their customer is.
Exactly.
So that's very interesting.
In another area where we're particularly seeing a trend, and maybe by the end of 2017 we might see that change rather than 2018 itself, is that every co-working space, every office has one strength of theirs, where we try to create our strength and keep for is our service model. How does each seat get a contextual strength for them? If someone needs a mentor, so be it. If someone needs a lead, so be it. Someone needs seed capital, how do we get? So what we're seeing particularly is, and we're being approached towards, how do we, and the term right now is, it's a very commercial term, how do we power others? But at the same, so to your point of collaboration, it's every co-working space can actually collaborate in their own aspect of strength, because you're catering to one ecosystem. Whether it's a corporate or it's a startup, the ecosystem is the same. And I think the trend will move towards a sense of how do you use someone else's advantage and turn it into your advantage, and work together, because you're working towards a very similar market.
So that's really interesting, and I'm personally looking forward to see a lot of people jumping from traditional offices to co-working spaces, because that makes them more accessible. And it was great chatting with you guys, and thanks for being here on our very first video podcast. It was great huddling with both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
bad. One blooper in 26 minutes is good, huh? Yeah.